So welcome everyone. Thank you for being with us here today. My name is Hannah Thomas and I am the research coordinator for the AWS National Med Student Committee. And I am joined by Mary Siki, our associate research coordinator. And we are both delighted to be here, so thank you for coming. Today represents the first in our new installment of the AWS Research Methods Workshop Series. And this series will be a bi-monthly, so every other month, event focused on different commonly used research methodologies. And we are very excited about this opportunity to come together and build our internal and external research capacity together by learning from some of the best experts in the field along the way. Today, our workshop is focused on qualitative methodology. We will begin with a lecture from Dr. Gretchen Schwarze. Dr. Schwarze is a board-certified vascular surgeon and medical ethicist. She is a nationally recognized expert in surgical decision-making, informed consent, advanced directives, and end-of-life care. And her research specifically focuses on improving communication between older patients and their surgeons so that patients can avoid unwanted treatment and make decisions that align with their values, preferences, and goals. Dr. Schwarze authored the JAMA Qualitative Methodology paper that we sent out via email, so we are incredibly honored to have her with us here today. She will begin with a presentation and we will moderate a Q&A after. So please post questions in the chat or the Q&A box as we move along, and we will compile them for the end. Thank you so much, Dr. Schwarze, for being with us here today, and feel free to get started whenever convenient.
All right, so we're going to talk about qualitative methodology. For those of you guys who don't use Zoom a lot, I did try to suggest a way to see both the slides and the people in the audience. So if you go up to the top, you can do this view options and hit side-by-side mode. And then when it comes up, you should see maybe my picture or maybe me and Hannah and Mary on the side. And then you can actually move this little bar over to this side and then get, you know, sort of a half and half. Now you should have like 3 pictures there because this is my slide. And then anybody, I think it's actually really helpful to chat during the talk. And that's not because I'm going to answer your questions during the talk, but things might come up as they go along, and it would be a helpful way to order the questions in the chat. And also, I don't want you to forget the things that you wanted to ask as they come up in real time. So I'm not going to respond to the chat, but please, by all means, feel very free and open to put things in the chat so that we can discuss them as we're going along. All right. So I have huge concerns that everybody loves to count things, but the problem with counting things is you have to know what it is you're counting, and you have to understand whether it's even reasonable to why it would even matter to know how many of something there is. And so one of the things I really love about qualitative research is it allows you to get to spaces where you can't count things, or where the measurement is so nascent or naive or underdeveloped that you can't actually count things because there's no bins to put everything in. And I do worry that we live in a world that's very interested in counting things, but that means that we only count things that we can measure, and there may be things that matter to us that we can't count yet. And so we need to find a strategy to work with that. And I think qualitative methodology can help. It's not the answer to everything, but I actually think that all methodologies have their own blind spots and downsides. And one way to try and get at the truth is to use a bunch of different methodologies together, recognizing that sometimes you can get the blind spots to overlap, or for one methodology to cancel out the other and get a better sense of what's going on. So I've used qualitative methodology quite a bit in conjunction with other things. So I really think the best time to use qualitative analysis is when you don't know where to start. It is a great way to get started. And I do worry that a lot of researchers tell this story like, oh, I had this hypothesis, and then I tested it, and then it was true, and then I moved on. But research doesn't really flow in a linear fashion, and I don't think people really, if you sort of knew the answer before you started, like, why are we doing research at all? And so it's often very challenging to come up with a research question when really what your question is what's going on here? And when your question starts to get down deep in the weeds of how is this happening and what is going on here, qualitative analysis is a really good place to start, because it can start to sort of show you some contours, it can show you the variation, it can show you things as they exist in real time, and then start to generate testable questions. It's also really good for thinking about things like social constructs. For example, race. Race is a social construct, and we should think of race as a social construct, but it's going to be really hard to do work on race if all we're doing is counting things, particularly when we're not even sure what that bin of race actually means. It is a great way to evaluate things like behaviors. That's really where I got into qualitative methodology, because I was interested in surgeon behavior, or interactions between surgeons and others, or interactions between patients and clinicians. Also this idea of group norms, like we all behave in a certain way, and it's in part because we think this is the way to behave. But if you haven't been able to characterize those ways, it's very hard to then critique whether those group norms are reasonable or whether they're unreasonable. I like qualitative analysis these days in my work because I'm really interested in this idea of meaning, that the words and language that we use create signals. And they create signals because they have big, heavy meanings attached to them. But if you don't unpack what things actually mean, it's very hard to understand what people are trying to say. So communication isn't just about I said this and you said that. It's about trying to figure out what the meaning of the words are in order to figure out what the subsequent actions might be. I also love it for two additional reasons. One is that oftentimes we are trying to figure out whether policies are effective. And policy is a really big word, but it can be anything from like, how does a checklist improve surgical site infections or safety in the operating room? That's a policy, right? The hospital came down and said, we're going to use a timeout and a checklist, and this is what's on our checklist. But trying to evaluate how those things actually work really does require qualitative methods, because it's not just one outcome that you want to look at. It's probably a whole range of different interactions between people on how those policies get carried out. And not just the outcome that you care about, but the disincentives. Like all policies have side effects, just like all medicines have side effects. And so you want to be able to evaluate those as well, and qualitative methods do a great job with that. And then the last thing, and I think a lot of people who do surveys don't recognize this, but it is really important to start with qualitative methodology when you're doing a survey. And my plan was to just start with a survey, and had I not started with qualitative methods, I'm not sure I would have asked the right questions. But the other thing about qualitative methods is you can do something called cognitive interviewing, meaning that once you set up your survey questions, you can go and do these cognitive interviews, which are open-ended interviews that you use to talk to people, and you give them your survey and you say, read this question out loud. And then you say, think out loud, talk to me about what this question means to you. Because you might imagine that if you ask 10 people the same question on your survey and they all interpret what you're asking as a different question, then even though they've all marked, 1 or 5 on your Likert scale, you have not actually counted up the same thing for each of those people. So qualitative analysis meshes very nicely with survey research because it makes sure that you have internal validity of your survey questions. So any of you who are interested in doing surveys, I really encourage you to, at the very least, do this cognitive interviewing, which is a qualitative method. All right, so within qualitative analysis, there are multiple methodologies, and I would say that most of us end up using something called content analysis. And that's this idea that I'm going to collect my data, and then I'm going to look at specific types of content within my data, and then I'm going to describe it to you. And usually when people are saying qualitative analysis, the idea is I'm going to characterize it for you. And that doesn't mean I'm going to give you generalizable statements. It means that I'm going to describe it for you you in a way that you understand that there's variation, there's depth, there's breadth, and in some places there's a lot, and in some places there's a little, but that doesn't matter quite so much as the fact that there is a range of construct within this content that I'm trying to now describe to you. These other methodologies are very interesting and very labor intensive. Ethnography is this idea that you go and you put yourself in the place. Like you can imagine like your anthropology friends from college, the ones who got a PhD and they're like in Peru in some, village and they're fishing or something, right? That's like you put yourself in the situation for a long period of time and you describe what's going on. One of the best ethnographies in surgery is actually this book cover that I have up here. It's a wonderful book by Charles Bosk, who put himself on the surgical service in 1974 at the University of Chicago. And he describes the group norms of surgery. And honestly, it's an old book, but if you read it now, you will recognize what it is like to be on a surgical team because of how he integrated himself into the culture and to the daily habits of the surgical service, and then was able to describe it in a way that has deep resonance and very long-lasting power. Phenomenology is kind of like that, but it is based around this sort of notion of studying a specific phenomenon as opposed to just rooting yourself into a culture. I don't do enough phenomenology or have enough experience with it to describe it well, but I would put it kind of in the bin like ethnography. Many people in the surgical literature will say that they do grounded theory, and I'm not entirely sure that they're truly doing grounded theory. And I think what they mean is, I didn't know where I was going, so I started on the ground and I looked around. And I think that that is a great way to do qualitative analysis, but I'm not totally sure that that's grounded theory, because people who truly do grounded theory, they start at one point and then they use that one point to direct them to the next point. So for example, they'll think, oh, there seems to be a problem with the nurses on this floor about changing dressings. And so they go and talk to the nurses, and the nurses then start talking about something about the patients or the doctors or the, whatever it is. And then if you're doing grounded theory, you would follow all of those things. Whereas I think most of us, when we're designing a study, A, we probably don't have time to do that, but B, really want to focus on one aspect and would just hang with the nurses, or maybe the nurses and one other group, rather than sort of moving around as the data pulls you. Dimensional analysis and discourse analysis are often not used in the literature. Discourse analysis, I've seen a few papers in the literature. I think probably one of the best ones is by Mark Newman and Charles Bosk, again, in Milbank Quarterly. And they went and looked at surgical textbooks in the 40s and the 50s, and they described the use of the word high risk and what high risk meant in those textbooks, and then followed this sort of notion of risk through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, where risk ended up becoming a risk factor and something that you might actually mitigate. And so they watched these words change over time, so that noting that the meaning and how we even thought about taking care of patients. So in the 50s and 60s, we didn't take care of a lot of old people in the operating room because they were high risk. And then as risk evolved over time, we started thinking about risk factors, and that actually sort of opened up a way to take care of older patients in the operating room by thinking through their risk factors rather than just their age. All right, I'm going to keep going here. So what kinds of questions might you ask with qualitative analysis? And I've put up a bunch here, but they're really how or what questions. They're not how many, and they're not things like what's the incidence and the prevalence, and they're definitely not questions like you might ask in a clinical trial of, does this lead to that, right? They're not causality questions, but they're really sort of like, what's happening here? How did this go down? How do different stakeholders think about this? So my first foray into research came because somebody said to me, Gretchen, why do surgeons have such a hard time withdrawing life-supporting treatments on their postoperative patients? Is it because of their mortality statistics, or is it something else? And I was like, oops, sorry. I was like, huh, I hear what you're saying, and I know this phenomenon, but I'm not sure your story about why that is true. So I started by interviewing a bunch of surgeons in Wisconsin. And what I heard from them is that patients had agreed to do not just the surgery, but all of the postoperative life supporting treatments that might come up. And we called this phenomenon surgical buy-in. So we wrote a paper about surgical buy-in, and then we did a large national survey where I sampled almost 1,000 cardiac, vascular, and neurosurgeons about this notion of surgical buy-in. And indeed, about 75% of them said, yeah, absolutely. We talked about this in advance, and I expect that when we go to the operating room, it's not just the surgery, but all of the stuff that comes through it, comes along with it. And I was like, huh, okay. And they described it as a contract, that we had this agreement. I was like, I'm a surgeon, and I'm not really sure this conversation sounds familiar to me. And so my next question was, how do surgeons ask patients? How do they get into this? Oh God, sorry, I did something bad on Zoom. How do they get into this conversation that makes them think that patients have consented not just to surgery, but to be on a ventilator for 2 weeks after surgery, to put up with things like dialysis or more surgery, even if they're not aligned with their values and goals. So my question was, what happens here? How do surgeons ask patients to go through this? All right, so what did I do? So in qualitative research, the idea is to think of what your sample strategy is and then execute it in a way that's going to help you get the type of data that's going to shine some light on what you're looking for. In most other types of research, the goal is to have generalizability. And so your sampling strategy is to sample broad and to sample many. Now, if you're going to go and interview 100 people, you are not going to be able to have a good in-depth interview, and it's going to be very challenging to do an analysis of 100 in-depth interviews. And so by nature, you need to have a smaller sample, but it also needs to be defined in a way that says, I have chosen this sample for specific reasons, and that other people can understand your rationale. Most people will do something called purposeful sampling. So when I was thinking about this idea of trying to figure out what surgeons say to make them think that this buy-in agreement had occurred, I wanted to sample surgeons who do high-risk operations, right? I wasn't going to sample the endocrine surgeons and the breast surgeons because I thought, well, they probably wouldn't have a conversation about life-supporting treatments after a thyroidectomy. Whereas the cardiac surgeons, the hepatobiliary surgeons, the vascular surgeons, they would be more likely to do so. The other part of my sample that seemed important was to make sure that I had surgeons who thought they were good communicators, because I didn't want to know what the range of this conversation looked like. I wanted to know, in the highest group, people who thought they were really executing preoperative communication well, what do they think they're doing? What's happening in that space? Because I don't want to scrape the bottom of the barrel. I'm totally willing to admit some people don't do this. But people who think they're doing this, what does it look like? And then finally, the other part of my purposeful sample is to make sure that I didn't have unique geographical issues. So I did sample in Madison, Toronto, and Boston to try and make sure that if there were some unique geographical issues, that I would catch them. Now you may say, well, that's not a very representative sample, and you would be right. It's not a representative sample, but I'm not going after a representative sample here. I'm just trying to figure out what's happening so that I can ask the right next question and then see how representative that would be. And I think we worry a lot about these ideas of generalizability and representative. And I worry that to the degree that we make something representative, we have actually distilled out most of the heart of what might actually be valuable to know. And then the other piece I worry about with generalizable is, like, say the study says that 60% of people think X. So what am I supposed to do with that? Even if it's generalizable knowledge, how do I treat the person in front of me? Are they in the 60%? Are they in the 40%? And so I worry that we're very fascinated with big numbers and small p-values, but I'm not entirely sure what to do with that data, or that data is that much more valuable than the type of data that comes out of a qualitative study. Other sampling strategies include things like convenience. So I could have said, well, I'm just going to do the surgeons here in Madison because that's convenient. And that is at least a boundary. And a lot of people will come and say, oh, I want to sample the whole country. And I think, well, yeah, I get it. The whole country is different, but that is a really big boundary. And I don't know that it helps you to sample one person from Wisconsin and one person from California and one person from Louisiana and one person from Maine, right? And so trying to figure out what your boundaries are, even by convenience, is very important. Some people will use this notion of a contrasting case, and one of my favorite papers is a JAMA paper, and it looked at the use of beta blockers after myocardial infarction, and they looked at high-performing hospitals and low-performing hospitals. And I love that because they said, not only do we care what's happening at the high-performing hospital, but we're going to use this low-performing hospital to really flesh out the details about what's working and what's not working. And so I think to the point where you can get things that come out on opposite sides, that's a nice way to do your analysis, to really figure out like what's common and then what's different, and how much is that related to the fact that this is just a different case. Snowball sampling is often something that you do for things that are very rare. So I have a colleague who is quite interested in positions on abortion in OBGYNs who worked in who were very Catholic in their beliefs. And you might imagine, like, A, that people don't advertise that, but B, that's not probably a very big group. And so what they did was something called snowball sampling. They found one person, they interviewed that person, and then they asked that person to identify other people who might have similar backgrounds and beliefs. And that's how they were able to create their cohort. Sometimes your purposeful sample needs to be stratified, like you would do the same in clusters. And then you can also do sort of this random purposeful sampling. And I think that it really depends on what you're looking for and what kind of bins are important for getting the work done and what kinds of bins don't matter. But randomization here does not do what it does in other settings. And so it's important to remember that randomization isn't required. All right. So there are many ways to collect data in a qualitative study. I already told you about Chuck Bosk, but he did direct observation. You can just go and sit there and watch and see what happens. For this study that I'm telling you about, we did direct observation, but I have to tell you, I was not sitting in anybody's office listening to surgeons talk to patients. I just turned the audio recorder on in their office, but that's direct observation, right? I'm not asking them questions. I'm not giving them any prompts or any sort of survey or anything else to influence my data collection. I'm just observing what's happening. Some people will look at texts or words, like the study I told you about where they looked at high-risk surgery, right? They looked at textbooks, they looked at articles. Many people will use open-ended interviewing. This is a really nice first project. That was my first project. And it allows you to really narrow your focus a bit more than direct observation. Like direct observation, you're going to get a lot of stuff that's hard to know what to do with. Whereas if you're asking the question, you're more likely to get stuff that's sort of at least in your field, if not in your ballgame. The hard part about interviewing is you want the interview questions to be open-ended. So things like, tell me the story of when, or what did you do when you saw this happening? You don't want to ask things like, do you think, or, you know, like it just, things that end up with 1 or 2 word answers are not going to be very helpful. I also think the problem when you're interviewing people, particularly people who are professionals and who are used to trying to sort of assess a situation generally, as opposed to tell you their experience, they'll be up on this meta level, that it's helpful to use a vignette, meaning I'm going to tell you a story and I want to know your reaction to the story. And that's different than saying to somebody, what is your reaction? Right? Because sometimes people will say, well, what I usually do is, and you don't actually want them to respond with what I usually do. You want to say, I just set up this story. I told you you're the doctor. Now you need to tell me how you feel about what just happened. Because you don't want to hear, oh, well, what I think is happening. You want to hear, I'm pissed, or this is really sad for me, or I didn't know what to do in this setting. Right? So using a vignette is very helpful when you're doing interviews. And then finally, focus groups. I always think of focus groups as like market research. So the idea about focus groups is you want about 6 to 10 people in your group, and you want them to respond to something, and you want that thing that they're responding to all be the same. And it needs to matter that they're bouncing off each other, that when they hear what somebody else says, they don't even think, they think partly about what you've showed them, but they've also thought a little bit about what that person said, and that influences their reaction. And so like, many of you might know I do this thing called best case, worst case. It's a communication intervention. And we took best case, worst case to senior centers in the state of Wisconsin. And we showed them a video, and then we asked them to respond. And that was really helpful to see them feed off of each other. And then we took the same video and we showed it to surgeons and watched the surgeons feed off of each other. So I love focus groups because you can get a real response to something that you're putting out there. But focus groups aren't great unless you have something for people to respond to. Otherwise, it may just go off the rails pretty quickly. All right, so in this study where I was trying to figure out whether what was happening for this buy-in agreement, I had surgeons who were talking about abdominal aortic aneurysm repair, brain tumors, cabbage, lung volume reduction surgery. God, do they even do that anymore? I have no idea. You know, big liver operations and some other miscellaneous high-risk operations. And this is what our characteristics look like, right? So I purposely selected the surgeons, but I didn't necessarily purposely select the patients other than to say that the patient needed to be seeing a surgeon who was talking about a high-risk operation. So, you know, my patient characteristics table looks pretty much like a patient characteristics table for most studies, actually. And then the next thing that happens with qualitative analysis is you get a lot of data, and it's very unwieldy because it doesn't come with like little numbers attached to it that you can just summarize with means and standard deviation, right? What you get is like a ton of words. And so what we got was, you know, 50 transcripts of surgeons talking to patients about major operations. So the next step is something called coding, where you sit down and you try to chunk out the data into pieces that you may be able to then group together. And that feels really awkward because you're like, well, how do I know what this data is? But humans are pretty good at making categories. And what I would generally do, so there's two ways to make a coding taxonomy. One is an inductive strategy, meaning that you go at it with absolutely no idea what you're going to find. And you say, I am just going to try and catalog this data based on what's in the data. Another is a deductive strategy, meaning like I have a theory about what should be here, and I'm going to use these components of the theory to tag my data so that when these components come up, I can find them. All of what coding is the way to catalog the data so you can do the next step in the analysis. Coding is not to catalog the data so you can count the little bits, because you haven't actually generated a sample where counting the bits is going to give you good inferences. Like, I don't want to show up and say, well, we saw this happen 50 times out of 1,000 episodes where it could have happened, right? Because if I've done purposeful sampling, I should not be thinking, well, 5% of people do this. Right? You have to do random sampling, and you have to do it in a generalizable sample in order to make inferences that go along with percentages and numbers like that. So the coding is really to tag the data for future analysis. And then most people will do something called constant comparison, meaning you get a whole group of people to read through the transcript, you write down what you think you see, and then you compare it with the people who have gone through it with their little tags on the data. And then you start to say, well, you called it this and I called it this, but it seems to me we're both talking about the same thing and we need a name for it. So for example, I had a nurse who worked in the critical care unit for years before she got her PhD, and she was working on my coding team. And she kept writing education, surgeon education. And I was like, what are you talking about? I don't do education. I'm a surgeon and I have these conversations, and never once in my life have I thought of it as education. But in her mind, this was sort of one of the functions of what clinicians do, is that they educate patients. Whereas I wrote down surgeon-patient understanding of disease. that I thought the surgeon was trying to get the patient to understand their disease in order to help the patient make a decision. So, you know, I'm kind of a bossy surgeon, so I might have won that naming, but at the end of the day, it didn't matter what we named it, right? We could have named it star or box or circle, but the idea was the same. We both identified it consistently throughout the data because we could see what the surgeons were doing. So the names don't matter quite so much other than to help you recall what you were trying to tag. Because you're not really going to present data that says we found, you know, this many episodes of education. Who is coding probably does matter because all of us bring our own stuff to data. And this happens not just in qualitative research, it happens in all types of research. But it is important in qualitative research to first put your biases on the table and then to bring people with multiple different perspectives, recognizing that the data that you have is mostly words and the words have meaning, and words have meaning not just because there's a dictionary, but because we live in a context with those words, and what the word means to me might be words that mean something different to you. And I think this sort of discussion about education versus understanding is a good notion about, like, you know, a nurse might see that as something different than a surgeon. So then the next thing is something called axial coding. So the first thing I just described is called open coding. And then the next bit is called axial coding, where you try to sort of figure out where the groups cluster. So what did we do? So for this study, we had people from multiple different perspectives doing the coding. We all coded all of the transcripts, and then we got together for consensus coding. And that doesn't mean that we all had to agree. It just meant that while we were trying to get consensus, we were actually able to explore places where we didn't agree. And that really helped us to do some of the higher level analysis, trying to think through what was going on there. So I think a lot of people try and work towards consensus, but consensus isn't always helpful. Sometimes it's really helpful to have dissent and then to describe why the dissent exists. All right. The other thing you want to do while you're doing your coding is to think about how the data is being collected. And if the data is being collected in a way that needs more feedback, you can feedback to the person who's collecting. Now, this is something that offends people who do a lot of quantitative research, who say, we're only using one survey. And you should only use one survey if you're doing quantitative research. And we're not adjusting the survey midstream because I can't count the answers to the second survey as the same as the answers to the first survey. And they're right about that. But in qualitative analysis, once you've, if you start to explore something and you don't get enough, then your feedback to the interviewer is, this part is important. Remember when you asked this question? I want to hear more about this. Push this person to tell you more about this so you can start getting more data on it. And the beauty of it is that sometimes you don't know what's there. And then when you start to uncover what's there, all of a sudden there's a lot more to explore. And so that allows you to do simultaneous feedback between your data collection and your data analysis, and to make sure that you explore things out to their end, where once you've explored them, they start to repeat and you're like, okay, we've got this enough. All right. So this is a little blurry, I'm sorry, but what we do with our data is we use a program called InVivo. There are several programs that will help you catalog your codes. This one, InVivo, makes these funny little blue dots, and you can see some of the names of our codes, right? Patient understanding doctor procedure, patient understanding doctor uncertainty. Don't name your codes anything that begins with patient or doctor, because before you know it, you have 20 codes that start with patient and doctor, and then you're lost. So that's a rule in the Schwarze lab. You can't make this bad mistake again. But you can imagine that these are the things that came up as we are going through these data. There are other programs that will help catalog your codes. One's called Atlas. And then there's another one that I can't remember offhand because I've never used it before. Many people, when they write up their report, will say, we used this program to do the analysis. And I always feel like that's a little fingers on the chalkboard when I'm reviewing a qualitative paper, because these programs don't do the analysis. They'll facilitate the analysis, or they'll catalog your codes, but the person doing the analysis is actually you, right? You, the investigator, are doing the analysis. Whereas I think that's a little bit different than when you're talking about something like SAS or Stata that you're using to do the analysis. And that doesn't mean you haven't set up the formula, but you are actually setting up the formula, cooking it to the data, and then SAS and Stata are like running the analysis. In Vivo and Atlas, they don't do that running function. You are the running function, so just be careful when you write it up to say, we used in Vivo, but we used it to catalog the codes or to facilitate our analysis so we could go back and find things. So this is what in Vivo looks like. It looks kind of like a Word document, actually. And you can see that the transcript is this thing in the middle, and it's been transcribed. The audio recording's been transcribed by somebody who is really good about saying who was saying things and what they said. And then this is our whole taxonomy of codes that we've developed over time. And then this is how the code has been labeled. So this big purple code is called Patient Understanding Doctor Disease. You can tell I did this a long time ago because that's a really crap code name. But it meant something to me at the time, and it was useful. And really, you know, what the doctor is saying is that the last valve here called the aortic valve, it opens well, it doesn't close well, so it leaks, right? So the surgeon is trying to explain to the patient that, you know, what's going on with the aortic valve. The surgeon is trying to get the patient to understand their disease. That's how we coded this. It doesn't mean you would code it the same way, but I suspect if you did an analysis, you might find codes that group together in the same way our team found codes that group together. All right, so higher level analysis. This is the second step in doing qualitative analysis. And I'll be honest with you, it's a bear. It's very, very hard to do, in part because, you know, you just have all this stuff filed away, and now you have to get it out of the file and make sense of it. And I think, you know, people feel like qualitative, I've heard very derogatory comments like it's make it up as you go along research. And I think it comes out of this process that people really struggle to understand. But at the end of the day, all research is looking for patterns in the data. And sometimes there are really predetermined ways to find those patterns, like a multivariate analysis, and sometimes there are not. And there are advantages to having a multivariate analysis, but I have to tell you there's some real disadvantages too. And one of the disadvantages is that the world does not exist in a linear fashion, and that because what you're trying to do is describe the state of the world as it is, as opposed to the way the world fits into your model, you have more freedom and opportunity in qualitative analysis to draw the world as it is. So this is what happened in my lab. Like, we're really trying to figure out how all of these pieces go together. Again, we were really interested in this issue of buy-in, like, are surgeons asking people up front explicitly to buy into postoperative life-sustaining treatments? What I love about qualitative research is that we found a lot of other stuff. We used to have a chair of surgery who said, I know this doesn't happen anymore because everybody gets a CAT scan, but he was old. And he would say, I love the acute abdomen. It's like Christmas morning. You never know what you're going to get when you open it up. And I still probably really love general surgery because of exactly that thing. But this is what qualitative research is like too, right? You go out after one question and you open it up and there's other stuff there and it's super interesting. And you would never have found it unless you cast this sort of wide net. And I would say that's kind of the hazard of other methodologies, is that they're really focused on one thing, right? You go and you ask a very discrete question, and it doesn't allow you this moment of exploration where you find other stuff. Sure, you can do an exploratory secondary analysis, but this is kind of baked into the qualitative research, which is that you may find something you didn't know was there. And that's exactly what happened with this study, is that we found two things that were really interesting. One was that the surgeons kept saying, you know, it's big surgery. And the other thing is that they use this mental model of decision-making around, we're going to fix your problem. So we do a lot of this mapping. It looks exactly like this. And many of the people who work in my lab tease me, and they'll make like some little drawing of triangles and squares and circles and give it to me and be like, I'm done. But it is a very complicated way to try and get the data to work. The other way I think about it is to try and put things into really big tables where you group like to like and start to see where the patterns of the data come together. And then really the thing I think pisses people off the most when they're trying to do a qualitative research paper is that a lot of the analysis comes during the writing process. And if you think about, doing a straightforward quantitative analysis with first, you describe the sample, you do a bivariate analysis, then you do your multivariate analysis, like you do all of that before you write the results. And then the results section gets written in like 20 minutes, right? You just write it out because it's done. But with qualitative analysis, you're doing this rich description. You need to capture the variability in the data and say, there's a lot of this, there's a little bit of this. And I don't mean quantitatively. I mean, you need to describe the contour and the variation that's there. And that's all in the writing. And so I think people feel super frustrated when they go to sit down that it's not all done. But really, that's where you're doing a lot of the analysis. All right, so I wanted to talk just a little bit, oh gosh, it's gone really fast, about directed analysis. So this was the other piece that we were interested in, this notion of fix it. This came out of the data. And I was like, that's gotta be a thing, right? Like we're not the first people to find this fix it idea. So one of my residents went off to the literature and she found this great paper by Joanne Lynn and Dave DeGrazia about this fix it model. And they had this notion that people believe health is being normal, that illness is that you're broken, you make a diagnosis, you're a deviant from normal, and that what medical care does is make you normal again. And what Lynn and DeGrazia say is, well, sure, that works fine if you have appendicitis or strep throat, but it doesn't work for chronic illness at all. And it's not really a sort of a real model of health, right? Health can't just be being normal, right? It's got to be something more than that. And so we started to look at our data using their conceptual model of this fix-it model. And we realized that surgeons were really embracing this fix-it model in order to talk to patients about having surgery, which I thought was like a really interesting thing, which I never would have known had I not started listening to these conversations. They said things like this: the artery should look smooth, but it doesn't look like that. They'd use these really funny analogies. Like, it's like somebody knocked down a tree trunk and this tree trunk falls. One surgeon was like, it's like you're in the shower and you're trying to fix the shower head while you're getting wet. I mean, there are all these like very funny analogies that people used, talking about the patient's problem as being broken or blocked, leaky, disordered, or damaged, and then how surgery would go on and change that, right? It would fix it. And so the surgeons, so this is what our data looks like, right? It's real quotes from what surgeons were saying. And you can see how once we start characterizing the data, you can see how these quotes go along with our characterization of it, right? We're going to build a bridge. We create a tube with some fancy stapling devices, and we create this tube out of your stomach after we take your esophagus out, because your esophagus is damaged with the cancer. And then surgeons go on to reject the fix-it model. They say, well, maybe it's too broken to fix, maybe it's not broken enough to fix, or maybe I can fix your problem, but you're not going to actually feel any better. But I think just being able to diagram out these conversations, and you can tell this has absolutely nothing to do with the question I started with, was a really important thing. So I have just a few more slides and I want to leave some time for questions. Hannah, am I doing okay time-wise? I don't want to screw up the discussion.
No, yeah, that's great.
It's okay?
Yeah, 5 more minutes or so and then we can do questions.
Okay, all right.
Great, thank you.
All right, so how do you judge whether your research is any good? And this is a problem because not many people do qualitative research and people really struggle to judge it. I would also say it's a problem in quantitative research because people just say, well, they have a really large number and they have a very small p-value. And I might suggest that that's not a good way to judge the quality of research either. But there's no heuristics like that in qualitative methodology. So people talk a lot about dependability and credibility. Like, have I described my research process and procedures well enough for you to believe the results that I'm presenting to you here? And really, they have this idea of this notion of an audit trail, that if I have described it well enough to you, you could see how you would come to the same conclusion. Then there's this next thing about resonance and transferability, which is that if I describe it with deep, rich, contextual detail, it will resonate with you. Maybe you haven't experienced it, but it seems very transferable or applicable to other spaces of your life. And I don't know how many of you have seen this video with, if you just Google orthopedics versus anesthesia, it will come right up on YouTube. And really it's the orthopedic bear just telling the anesthesia bear, I have a fracture, I can fix it. And I do think that that's a way to think about this paper we wrote about this fix it language, right? It's funny because it resonates with real life. And our paper about fix it probably reflects many more conversations than the ones that we looked at, just because it resonates with people, right? People see themselves doing this. It's not like we told some story that was deeply far-fetched. And then sort of, we found examples of this sort of fix-it model all over the place after we started doing ours. And this is a really beautiful paper out of the New Yorker, where this woman talks about, she had some sort of autoimmune disease, but she talked about, you know, healthcare. She's like, isn't that what healthcare does? It finds out what's wrong with you and then it treats you. And I think that, you know, recognizing that this is a pretty deeply embedded model, not just in surgeons, but also in patients, is a pretty important thing to understand. All right, I'm not gonna play the video because we don't have time, but you can Google it and laugh yourself. It's got like a zillion hits. So how do you present this data? So this is one of the big challenges of qualitative research. Most abstracts, you get 250 words, and if your data is words, it really chews up your abstract very quickly. The results are very challenging to present in small doses, particularly again, because your data is words. You know, JAMA surgery, 3,000 words is all you get for a paper in JAMA surgery. And so it is very hard to get a qualitative paper in that kind of space. I think people really struggle with this notion of how do I interpret this, because what they're used to doing is using the percentages in your quantitative paper to make inferences. And that is probably dangerous in that setting, but it is not something you can do in this setting at all. And I have had many editors say, well, I just want to see the numbers. And I will say, I'm not putting the numbers in because people will misinterpret them, and that's not okay with me. And then finally, there's real publication bias out there. So this link here is from BMJ, and I know that your paper today is from BMJ, and I just love that paper. But BMJ, soon after that paper came out and said, we're not publishing qualitative data anymore. And there was a big brouhaha about it, but that is still their policy. The other problem is that there are many people who are just not qualified to review qualitative studies. And this is a review that I got on a study that I thought was just the bee's knees. And the reviewer actually thought it was pretty great too. And then you can see at the end, he says, you know, while clearly stated and well illustrated, the interviews in their analysis do not uncover anything particularly new. These findings resonate with my reviewer's experience. Right? That is, like, by definition, high rigor in a qualitative study, and yet somehow it was not recognized as so because of sort of the notion of what research is. And so as much as I love qualitative papers that are done well, as I love this methodology because of that, you know, Christmas morning surprise, I have to caution all of you that it's very hard to get these papers published. All right, Hannah, should we take some questions?
Yes, thank you so much. That was fantastic. We currently have about 50 people attending. I know the attendees can't see the participants, but I just wanted to let them know that. And it's been really fantastic. So we do have some questions. So I'll just sort of go through them. So Anna would like to know, if the surgeon's conversations are being recorded, would there not be a bias wherein the surgeon would atlas his or her conversation with the patient?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people will call that, what do they call it? It's not nightingale. Oh, anyway, yes, you would think the surgeons would perform better when you're audio recording them. They're actually pretty long audio recordings, and the surgeons are really consistent. They have pretty good inner rater reliability in what they say. So I have a library of about 600 conversations between surgeons and patients. And maybe there's a little bit at the beginning. They're like, oh, we have to do a good job. And the patient's like, this doctor's really good. But ultimately they get into it. And the reason they get into it is because the patient has esophageal cancer or aortic valve stenosis or brain tumor. And they're actually really having a conversation about that. And the audio recording just sort of fades away. But sure, yeah, you can have some biases there, absolutely.
And Gabriella would like to ask, could you please explain once again what vignettes, or clarify what vignettes mean in terms of data collection?
Yeah, and I'll just use an example to clarify that what that was. So our first paper about surgical buy-in. I was really interested in this issue of postoperative life-supporting treatment. And I didn't want to go to the surgeon and say, why are you struggling with this? Why is this such a problem? Because they would give me some answer that they had formulated in their head. So what I did was I made a vignette and I said, you are taking care of a 75-year-old patient. And if it was a cardiac surgeon, I'd say, and the patient just had a cabbage. And now the patient is in the ICU with a postoperative pneumonia and a stroke, and it's post-op day 7, and the family has shown up with an advance directive saying that the patient doesn't want treatment like this. And the family is saying, you need to withdraw life-sustaining treatments. And then I say to the surgeon, how would you handle this situation? Right? And it's because I don't want to hear what the surgeon thinks he might do. I want to hear what they think they would do. Right? I want them to react to this situation in front of me. And indeed, they got pretty pissed off. They were like, they have totally betrayed me. Why didn't I know this before surgery? And we had an agreement, right? But I wouldn't have found that if I said, why do you think you have a problem with this, right? I needed to give them a space where I could say, imagine yourself in this space now and tell me what you would do next. Not what you think about what you would do, but what you would do. And so by giving people vignettes, you can put them on the ground instead of up at this meta level when where they're trying to interpret for you what's going on. So the vignette's like a story, right? And you say, I'm not giving you all the details, but these are the details, you might care about. Sometimes they backfire, but I think they work really well.
And Laura has just put in the chat that Hawthorn bias is.
Yes, Hawthorn. Yeah, the Hawthorn effect. People are going to do better because they know they're being watched. Yep.
We have a question from Catherine, who is asking, in my experience with qualitative research, I always feel like we could do more interviews or have more people review transcripts to add new perspectives, especially with global health projects. How do you know when your data collection or analysis is sufficient to share with others through publication?
Yeah, so sample size is a huge issue that I think people really struggle with. And I think some of it, there's two issues. One is you got to put the boundaries on at the beginning, right? And so if you're thinking global health, right, we're not going to be able to have a qualitative paper about the world, right? That is a very big boundary. But I might even say having a qualitative paper about a specific country may be too big of a boundary because there may be so much variability within that country that it's really hard to sort through the data or capture the kind of variability that you want. So you want to try and get the boundaries to the point where there's at least some homogeneity in what you're studying, that you can capture the variation within the homogeneous area. Then the second piece is this idea of theoretical saturation, which is you're done when the data starts to repeat at a certain space with regularity. And that's hard because oftentimes you have to state your sample size up front for the IRB. You don't have to state it up front for a qualitative study the way you do for a clinical trial or even many quantitative studies to suggest that you're well powered to assess your effect. But oftentimes you have to tell the IRB, we think it's going to be this many interviews and it might be this many more. And so sometimes you end up with more data than you need. Like it actually does repeat a bit earlier, but it feels really bad to collect the data and not analyze it.
Thank you. Melanie is asking when trainees interview faculty Zoe is asking when trainees interview faculty or practicing surgeons about clinical practices, how might hierarchy play into or impact interview responses?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I actually think trainees are some of the best people to do those interviews, in part because they're kind of undifferentiated. Like people don't necessarily know your biases up front. Like I never do the interviews. I never do the focus groups, in part because I love to talk, obviously. But the other piece of it is that, if I do a focus group and I'm a surgeon sitting in front of a bunch of older people at a senior center, they're going to treat me very differently than they're going to treat somebody without a professional position. And when we first did our buy-in study, we had a resident go out and do the interviews, in part because the other investigator on this is Karen Brazel. And between me and Karen Brazel, we were worried that the surgeons were going to think, oh, all they want to hear about is palliative care. We don't want, and we were afraid that the surgeons were just going to tell us what they thought we wanted to hear instead of what they were thinking. And so I actually think the trainee's position is a great position for data capture because you can come off as a neutral party. I agree there's some hierarchy there, but sometimes that you can play to your advantage.
Perfect. Yeah, I just look at the chat. Laura was asking, just to piggyback on one of our previous questions, is there a minimum number of surveys that one should aim for?
Oh, surveys? So surveys are a little different. And it's always hard to know what you're measuring with a survey. The biggest problem with a survey is actually response rate, not necessarily how many, right? So I could collect 2,000 surveys, but if my response rate is only 10%, then it's not a very generalizable survey, right? If I do a big internet survey and I send it out to, 50,000 people and I get 1,500 back, that's not a generalizable survey, right? All you've gotten back are the people who have some reason to respond. And so figuring out numbers for surveys is a challenge, and I don't think I can give you a solid rule about that. For trying to think about sample size and qualitative methods, I usually go to the literature and find a study that I like that's similar to my study and figure out how many people that they used. And I use that as my sort of justification for my sample size. And then I give myself some boundaries around that. So you want to say to the IRB, we estimate it'll be 30 people, but we think we need more. And I think it really depends on, again, the variation in your sample. So like when we interviewed the surgeons, 10 surgeons, and honestly, we had theoretical saturation at 6, right? Surgeons are like surgeons. But this collection of audio recordings of surgeons talking to patients had a lot more variation in it. It ended up being about 100 conversations between the first and second project that we did. And the reason is because the patients throw a whole degree of variability in there that is not accounted for by the surgeon. So I would say the surgeons are pretty consistent, but the patients aren't. And so once you throw another level of variability in there, if it's very heterogeneous, you actually need more, and then things get out of control very quickly.
And Jennifer's question sort of also addresses surveys and questionnaires. I will just say that our survey-specific workshop will be happening in January. So
Yay!
yeah, so everyone looks forward to that. But Melanie has a question about, I'm curious to hear about any challenges with finding qualitative research subjects who are willing to be observed via audio recording and how those challenges were handled.
Yeah, so yes is the answer to that. People don't like being audio recorded. The surgeons that I study typically are surgeons who think they're pretty good at communication, which for me is a study sample advantage. But you might imagine if I was looking for people who thought they weren't good at communication, it would be very hard to get them to consent to being audio recorded. When we did our PCORI study and we collected 450 conversations between surgeons and patients, we got a certificate of confidentiality from the NIH, which said that the audio recordings could not be used for lawsuits. Right, so we protected the surgeons. I actually think it's harder on the patients. The patients don't like being audio recorded, and so it does put up a barrier to getting the data that you want. So yeah, it's no doubt it's a challenge. Recruiting for studies is always a challenge, but I think you're right. People don't like the idea of being audio recorded. And I think we should be generous when we audio record people, that what you think you're saying and what you actually say may be two different things. And so it's worth sort of being generous in that when you're listening to them.
And we have one final question from Zoha, and they're asking, is data only collected through interviews or essentially talking to people? Or does qualitative analysis also entail data from previously published papers or textbooks?
Yeah, it can be all of those things. And I would say that if you're talking to somebody to collect your data, then you do want to develop an open-ended interview guide, meaning that you can say things like, tell me what happened, or tell me the story of what it's like when you accept a transfer patient from 3 hours away, and say things like, tell me more, or what happened when, and try to get them to tell their story. So that's kind of like talking to somebody. but you need to have it planned out. And you also need to have within your interview guide some notions about what are the things that you want to probe on. When they say, I talked to the person in the emergency room and they were really snooty to me, you might want to probe on that. What was going on there? How did that impact the transfer, right? So you want to have it sort of laid out, even though it feels like you're just talking to somebody. Other ways are, direct observation. And then you're right, you can use things like textbooks. I have a mentee who used the electronic health record in the ICU to look at goals of care. And you might say, oh, people don't write that in the electronic health record. But it's actually fairly interesting what people write in the electronic health record about goals of care. Like they do actually say goals of care in the electronic health record, but it may not be consistent with my definition of what that's about. And so just going through and looking at how people use certain words is actually fairly enlightening about the world in which they live and how those words do certain actions, right? Words have consequences. And by looking at the text itself and understanding the meaning by how it is used, you can actually open up a story that you hadn't seen before because you hadn't thought to look at what is the meaning of these words and how are people using these words differently and potentially not collaborating because they've used it in different ways or used it in a way that it was never meant to be used.
So there are a few more questions. I think because a few of us are moving on to the breakout room discussions, we'll end here, but maybe Mary, if you can post our Gmail in the chat and those people who have sort of some final questions can follow up and we can hopefully get those answered.
Yep. And I'm happy to answer questions via email as well.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. Would you mind sharing your email in the chat as well then, Dr. Schwarze?
I will do that. Oh crap, how do I do that?
But thank you so much for everyone's active engagement during the Q&A. I think it's been a really great session. And thank you so much, Dr. Schwarze, for providing your time and your expertise. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. You guys are amazing. I can't believe how many people are here. And Hannah and Mary, you did such a great job organizing it. It's super impressive.
Thank you. And we look forward to seeing everyone's future qualitative research projects coming out.
Absolutely.
There's just a few sort of admin things that I wanted to touch on before we end. So in the coming days, we're going to be sending out a takeaway document to the participants. So throughout this, Mary and I have been compiling sort of key pearls of wisdom and advice from you, Dr. Schwarze, and we'll put these together in sort of a bullet point review to send out to the participants. And then with this, we're also going to be sending out a feedback form to everyone. So given that this is our first workshop in the series, we would really greatly appreciate people's feedback so we can work to sort of strengthen our future sessions. So that will be sent out via email to everyone. And then before we conclude, I just wanted to briefly mention the second day of our AWS annual conference, which will take place on October 3rd. And in that day, we're featuring online workshops, research symposiums, and there'll be even a special yoga class. So Mary, I think is going to post the conference registration link, and we would love to see all of you there. We also wanted to take this time as well to let you know that our next workshop will take place on November 14th at the same time, 3 p.m. Eastern, and it will focus on clinical trials. So we'll be joined by Dr. Christina Rowland, who's really an expert in this field. And Mary is also going to post the registration link for that as well. So be sure to sign up for this. And as I mentioned, we're going to be compiling feedback and incorporating that into the future sessions to improve and build upon what we've started. And so with that, our central workshop will now conclude. However, roughly 50 of you have been allocated to participate in our follow-up breakout discussion rooms. So here we're going to go through an exemplar qualitative paper. I believe this was sent to everyone though, so feel free to review it on your own. And if you have follow-up questions, we can always, we'd be happy to discuss via email as well. If you'd like to participate in these small group discussions in the future and weren't able to do so this time, please be sure to sign up early as we usually select people just on a first come, first serve basis. So for those who were emailed today, please exit this Zoom link and enter the one that you were sent via email. So with that, we'll conclude, and thank you so much to everyone for attending today. We're looking forward to seeing you all at our future workshops. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Schwarze.
Thanks so much for having me. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, Dr.
Take
Schwarze.
care.